A few minutes, maybe a few hours before we came on air, the Pentagon announced that it will be training Ukrainian technical crews in Oklahoma on the use, operation, and maintenance of the Patriot missile system. How impractical and how slow is this going to prove to be?
Well, normally it takes 3 months of formal schooling for American soldiers to effectively master all the tasks that are expected of them to work on this very complex anti-missile system or anti-aircraft system. So I would think that for the Ukrainians, it might take a little bit longer simply because of the language barrier. But the point is, the way things are developing right now, I'd be surprised if they had much of a Ukraine to deploy to in 3 to 4 months.
You know, I don't even know if it's lawful for the American government to train foreign troops at American expense on American military property. Do you have any, in your long career in the military, do you have any familiarity or experience with this, Colonel?
A little bit. Obviously, with regard to Latin America, we've done this for decades. We actually established formal schools for it. The so-called schools of America used to be characterized in the most hostile terms by our opponents as having schooled most of the terrorists and so forth that they dislike. So no, this is nothing new. We've done this before. The CIA has done it for forever. My point is, I just don't think this is going to make much difference to the outcome on the ground in Ukraine. It simply won't. It's not going to happen fast enough. And then, of course, you've got to push everything over there, all the equipment. Then you have to provide lots of missiles. Remember, you shoot 2 missiles at every target. You could go through 1,000 missiles in Ukraine in a few days.
So the Patriots that the Biden administration is sending are not there. And when they do, I assume they're in Germany. I mean, they're not in the U.S., but it's going to take 3 months before the Ukrainians are prepared to use them. Where's the war going to be in 3 months? In 3 months, winter will be a little bit behind us.
Well, I think this is really the most important question today, because of all the information that's pouring into us right now. There's a great deal of information that the entire Ukrainian front facing the Russians in southern Ukraine is now severely weakened and in many parts simply crumbling. On average, the brigades that have been fighting the Russians in and around Bakhmut and surrounding towns, right now their casualties have reduced them to about 30% of their normal strength.
30% of the Ukraine normal strength.
Ukrainian 4,000-man brigade.
Wow.
So if you're talking about 4,000 men, that means that you've lost 2,800. We're talking in the space of the last few months, 15, 20 brigades have rotated in and out. They've now had to disband some of these brigades and consolidate them with others. I mean, frankly speaking, it's not the perfect analogy, but I would compare it to the Army of Northern Virginia in the spring of 1865. They've simply been bled white. And they're now building what they hope will be effective defenses in a town called Kramatorsk, a line that is much further north and west from where they are currently. They may be able to retreat to it, but I think once the offensives begin, Ukrainians are going to find that their backs are up against rolling open terrain, which is the perfect killing ground for the Russians against the Ukrainians. So I think we're really coming into the end phase of certainly the war in eastern Ukraine.
All right. So I know this is your field of specialty, which is tank warfare. The Ukrainians are still begging for tanks. The Chancellor of Germany has indicated he's willing to send German tanks to Ukraine. I don't know how easy it is for the Ukraine troops to operate German tanks, or if tanks are interchangeable, if the Germans are unique and requires a lot of training. However, he says he doesn't want to do that if German tanks are the only tanks in Ukraine. Hint, hint, he wants American tanks there. So a couple of questions. How practical or impractical is this for Ukraine troops to use German tanks? Is this the right time of year for tanks in Ukraine? And how crazy is the idea that the Americans would send tanks?
Well, you know, my view is that we should have stopped this a long time ago. So obviously I don't support the idea, but ideally you want one type of tank. You don't want to have to deal with 4 or 5 different kinds of tanks, because truthfully, the sighting mechanisms, the firing mechanisms, the training that's required for each one is different. So I do understand the desire to stick with one. The Leopard tanks are more exacting in their demands on the crew. than on an M1 tank. M1.
Right, so Leopard is American or German?
No, the Leopard series tanks are German. And having been on both of them, they're both excellent tanks. Let there be no mistake about it. Of the two, I would choose the Leopard simply because it has a good diesel engine on it. You don't have to refuel it every 6 to 8 hours. So from that standpoint, I would do so. I would opt for the German thing. But I understand the German position. I think the Germans are worried, and justifiably, I would add, that they're going to be hung out to dry. And their equipment will not only be destroyed, but in many cases captured. I think that's also a concern on the U.S. side. I think we know that the Ukrainian armed forces are crumbling.
Is this a mechanism for introducing German troops and American troops on the ground? Well, the equipment's there and you guys can operate it better than we can, and you don't need the lead time for training to use it because you already know how to use it. Is that what's coming?
Well, on the German side, I can tell you that if they were trying to secretly or surreptitiously introduce their equipment that could be manned by Germans into the theater, the German government would be thrown out of office within 24 hours. There's no support in Germany to send German troops, certainly not to Russia, certainly not to fight Russians. On our side, I don't know. I suppose that's a possibility, but I've seen so little evidence for a coherent strategy, so little evidence for serious pre-planning and preparation that it's hard for me to believe anybody's thinking that far in advance.
Earlier this morning, you sent me an email that you had received from an Australian colleague and observer of what he saw on the Ukrainian front. Here's what he said to you. According to an Australian source near the Bakhmut area in daily contact with the frontline Ukrainian soldiers, in my opinion, that talks about a Ukrainian offensives are nonsense. They deluded dreams of the Kyiv cabal to continue their push for more money, weapons, and support. The mood on the ground here is not good. Soldiers are severely under-equipped. Morale, from what I can see, is very low, and there is resignation among the ones that I talk to that they will fight on bravely, but that outcome is not in question. Interesting, Colonel, the outcome not in question. They know that they are facing a well-equipped, disciplined, and strengthening, another interesting word, strengthening Russian army. Confidence in the government or their leadership, that's the Ukrainian government, seems low, and there is rising anger amongst them. The same is true of ordinary people. Many are now speaking up. Many are openly critical of the Zelensky administration. They're openly angered at the West and feel betrayed. This will not end